Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Caring in Crisis, the Tuesday Briefs, a part of the Trauma Informed Faith Communities Project. I'm Reverend Mary Hughes with Crisis Care Ministries, and we are so glad that you all have joined us today. A few reminders before I introduce our speaker. We do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. At the end of the hour, we'll formally close the webinar and stop the recording, but if you'd like to stay on a little while, we'll open up the mics and be here for some more informal discussion. As you have seen in the introductory slide rotation, you can find all things webinar, details about our schedule and presenters, and resources our presenters have provided at crisiscareministries.net. Just click on the webinar hub at the top of the page. We also want to say a very special word of thank you to our funders and those who are providing training and resources for us. We simply could not do this project without them. Throughout the webinar today, please feel free to type questions or comments in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring those and hope to get to all of those questions before the end of our hour today. You'll be receiving a link to request attendance certificates, and if you have any questions, please contact Kyla Powers, and I'll put her contact information in the chat box as well. Now, before I formally introduce Carly, I do want to say one additional word. As we were planning this series, we could not have predicted what crises would be coming. We knew that the context would shift from the beginning of the webinar to the end, and we knew that you all would be right in the middle of those crises because we're on the front lines, those of you who are faith and community leaders. We could not have known the context of new tragedies that are unfolding on our screens every hour, and we could not have known that people that we know and love would be so few degrees of separation from people that they know and love who are suffering in Israel and Gaza. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that we're gathering as a people who really have never given up on faith, that we're loved and can truly be loved. And I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge our heartbreak and our prayers for peace and our prayers for miracles, and to thank you for all you all are doing to provide context and reflection within your communities. And now it is my honor to introduce to you my friend, Carly Rae Van Zandt.
Thank you, Mary.
Would you like me to read your bio, or do you want to jump right in?
I'm going to jump right in if that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Perfect. Let me go to this next slide here. So as you know, today's topic is crisis communications and implementing a plan in the event of a crisis. So it's never really a matter of if, but when, because to some extent, whether it's large scale or small, you're going to encounter something to where you do need to react in a very professional and proper manner. But let me kind of just go ahead and tell you a little bit about myself. So I currently am the public relations director at Hunter Care Health, and in the bottom right corner of the screen, you'll kind of see that logo of the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse. Hunter Care operates what's called MyCare Technologies, and it's a software program that is implemented on iPads, and these iPads have been distributed to all the certified community behavioral health centers across the state. They are within the ambulances with IMSA, so first responders utilize them, law enforcement utilizes it, and so we're part of the continuum of care with the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse. You're probably familiar with 988, which is a great service as part of that continuum of care. MyCare Technologies falls into that next line of crisis calls. So what ends up happening is if a first responder or police officer shows up at a scene and they've been called because someone is appearing that they're in a moment of psychosis, they can hit a crisis call button on that iPad, and it directly connects them to a licensed behavioral therapist. So it's a way to de-escalate the situation. They can do an assessment and determine if that person needs inpatient hospitalization. They can look at real-time bed registry to see if they have a bed available for that individual. And furthermore, after that patient, assuming they receive that inpatient care and they're discharged, they receive an iPad. So should they need to continue telehealth appointments, or they end up in a moment of psychosis again, they can hit that crisis call button. And so that kind of is part of that continuum of care. So that's why that logo is at the bottom of the screen there for mental health and substance abuse. Prior to coming to Hunter Care Health, I was at Catholic Charities as their director of communications. I still am signed on as a consultant with them. Prior to being at Catholic Charities, I was in radio broadcasting for about 10 years. I had held multiple positions there. I was on air. I was their digital program director. So I got to a point in my career, what I really wanted to do needed to be mission oriented for my own purpose of working in life. And so that's where I'm at now, Hunter Care Health in Oklahoma City. So a lot of people can pretty much identify what a crisis is. It's anything that's unplanned and unexpected. Sometimes you kind of see those things coming down the pipeline where you're like, okay, this could develop into a crisis pretty quickly. But crisis communication is really how you're going to disseminate your information in the midst of a crisis, okay? So has multiple purposes, but it's kind of to eliminate any damage for whatever organization you're working for. And it's a way to really work within and with outside of your organization. So it's really what your response to that crisis is going to be. And I want to reiterate that you need to have a response in the moment of a crisis. You never want to be that organization that's reported on that says they were not available for comment, or there always needs to be some sort of a statement made, and there's multiple ways to do that, but we'll get into that in a minute. So a crisis can happen in two different ways. It's either internal or external. So on your screen, you'll kind of see a list of different things internally. Could be a financial disruption, could be cybersecurity threat, a loss or illness of someone on your staff. That could be the termination or the unfortunate passing of someone on your staff or within your organization. Unfortunately, misconduct can happen, workplace violence, layoffs, things of that nature. An external crisis is more likely what could happen, but we'll kind of get into that as well. Here in Oklahoma, it's likely to be a natural disaster. There's always times that even if it's not something that directly impacts your organization, it could be severe flooding, it could be a tornado, it could be any kind of severe weather that's going to impact your operations of your organization. It could be theft or vandalism, security breach, things of that nature. So those are internal, external. Those are always things that you kind of need to be aware of that could and possibly will occur. So this is always shocking to me what the most common type of crises are. The biggest thing is a security attack. So this is somebody has hacked your website, someone has hacked some sort of donor portal that you might possibly have for your organization, your email accounts. Technology failure is not a cybersecurity attack. So let's say your website goes down, your email server's not working. That's not a security attack. It's simply a technology malfunction. A security attack is going to be where you have actively been hacked. That can happen, and whether it's going to happen or not, it's hard to say, but that's likely the most likely type of crises you're going to encounter. In Oklahoma, the natural disaster kind of is a little higher on the list. This is kind of a national crises type. So this is not going to be as accurate if you're operating a nonprofit or a religious organization, but all of these are likely threats that can happen. Workplace violence or threat. With things that are happening in Israel, a religious organization needs to be very vigilant. Coming from a Catholic background, recently up in Edmond, there was an individual who was, at a Catholic church up there, and they were seen, pulling out a gun. There wasn't a whole lot of information involved with that, not a specific threat involved, but still a threat nonetheless, and something that they did need to respond to the parishioners and to the media, because the media did catch wind of some of that as well. So with your organization, you really need to have a crisis communication plan. And this is really the most important element of mitigating what a crisis can entail. So Your plan's basically that blueprint. It's what it's going to be your go-to resource in the midst of a crisis, because it's going to outline certain positions within your organization and their contact information. It's going to outline what those responsibilities include in the midst of a crisis. And so your approach is going to be different depending on at what stage you are in that crisis. So I've outlined 3 of them on your screen: being proactive, reactive, and the recovery stage of it. So being proactive is, what are you doing to reduce or prevent a crisis before it occurs? Your reactive communication is, an unexpected event happens, it's your response, it's your reacting to that crisis. And then recovery is stabilizing your operations after a crisis. So these are all equally important no matter what stage you're in. Even if you're in that reactive moment of a crisis, you have to be very vigilant on that recovery end of it too. So I have a couple stats here. Good stat is 98% of organizations that had a crisis communication plan said it was effective. So it's a tool that you can lean on to ensure that you're not flustered in a moment. What can we do? What can we say? Who do we need to contact? That crisis plan is going to be in place. So you go to it and you say, okay, here's the first step. Here's the second step. The bad stats is that about 49% of companies don't have a formal crisis communication plan. So this is including companies, nonprofit organizations. And what's kind of startling about that is typically it's your companies that have more positions in place. They have more personnel, so if you are looking at a nonprofit or a religious organization, sometimes you have one person wearing multiple hats. So again, this makes it even more vital when you have that crisis communication plan to kind of outline exactly how you're going to respond and mitigate that situation. So here's what a communication plan is. It's your set of guidelines. It's your go-to guideline resource. It's a tool to manage and respond to a crisis, and it's detailed and it's up to date. That's a very important factor to consider. And it's also a part of your ministry because it's part of your voice for your organization. It's a voice of your religious organization. What it's not is a business continuity plan. It's not to say, if we have a cyber security attack, we need to do X, Y, and Z regarding how to fix that issue. That's not what your communication plan is. It's not a solution to whatever workplace violence could occur or whatever threat could happen to your organization. It's not a damage control tool. However, I will say that it can be a PR damage control tool, but it's not anything at hand that's going to help solve whatever your crisis is. And it's also not a one-time document, because as you encounter different situations that are going to shape and mold whatever that communication plan is. So in preparing your crisis communication plan, you need to kind of identify some certain things. So hazard identification is, what are things that are most likely to pose a threat to your organization? So we kind of listed some of the internal and external situations that can happen, but what's more likely to happen to your organization? So of course, I would always recommend, especially if you're in Oklahoma, to include natural disasters. So how are you going to respond to a natural disaster? So most organizations would likely respond in the same way. Cybersecurity threats going to be more specific. So that of course needs to be something that you need to kind of prepare for as in a statement, because there could be donors, parishioners, your churchgoers. These are people that can be involved if their information is in your system and your system's been hacked. Then there's a certain way to kind of mitigate how you're going to communicate with those people if that situation occurs. And of course, what's kind of going on in Israel, being vigilant to terrorism and acts of violence needs to be on the forefront as well. And I would say in today's world, that should always be a situation that you have identified as a potential hazard. Your vulnerability assessment is, in those situations, what are the assets that are most likely at risk? So it's your people. It could be a donor base. It could be your staff. It could be the operations of that organization. And then your impact analysis. So this is kind of determining if this particular crisis occurs, here's who's vulnerable, which would be who those people are that you would need to communicate with, and then how are they likely to be impacted by it. And that impact could be broken down in stages, which we'll get to in a minute, but this could be simple as it's disrupted the operation of your organization, or likely people aren't really finding confidence in what you're doing. And so a lot of that has to do with the response, which we'll get to as well. So when you're creating this crisis communication plan, and I have provided a template that Mary will have on uploaded to the website, there'll be an area and you'll start with your goals and objectives. So this is kind of figuring out, making sure that the response that you have is not without purpose. It's aligned to what your organization's broader mission is, and it's really that roadmap. So in doing that, you'll want to create an organizational framework. And so this is going to be, who are the people in management, who are the key stakeholders, who are the people who lead departments, if you will. Sometimes that's HR, it's executive directors. You may include your board of directors depending on what that situation is and what stage of a crisis and what level of escalation it's at. And moving to the escalation framework, this is how you're identifying what level of a crisis is. So something may be more severe and something may be more moderate or minor. And so it's kind of identifying those certain situations. And you can determine that escalation framework in your plan by kind of coming with some of those ideas of, a higher level crisis that's more severe may be a tornado has come through your community. It's you've lost power at your organization. You have possible parishioners who've been impacted by the severe storms, lots of lives. That's definitely going to be a higher level. And then you're identifying those different levels. Again, we'll kind of break down some of those examples and kind of show you how that looks. And then your communication framework this is really where your communication plan comes into play, because this is based on who the people are in your organization, how you're defining the severity of that crisis, and how are you going to respond to each of those levels. So a certain smaller scale level may be sending out an email to staff only. Another level of communication framework may require putting out a statement on behalf of your organization. And then one of your higher levels would be you're conducting a media briefing or sending out a press release. So here's how I have done organizational framework within the company that I'm at. I've got my list at the top here. Since I'm going to be leading any communicational efforts, that that's just, and this doesn't have to be done by hierarchy. But so it's listing who the team people are, their contact name, and their roles and responsibilities. So being able to identify exactly what that person does within the organization will determine, just kind of as you're looking at a crisis plan in the moment of a crisis, you can say, okay, this person's responsible for this. If there was a cybersecurity attack, I may look down at that customer support team. Notice that Billy Scott is part of that organizational framework. If he's overseeing, customer support operations, and there's been a cybersecurity attack for something like this, I'm definitely going to want to make sure that he's very much a part of that crisis communication team. Human resources, you'll want to keep involved. Now, for some organizations, you may have someone who's an office manager. They're doing the social media and they're the communications for your organization. So sometimes you may need to list that contact name more than once, but again, it's identifying exactly what that person does. So for instance, it says social media marketing. We have Haley Bush listed. So this lets me know that in the midst of a crisis, if she's responsible for content creation and management across social media, I need to make sure that she's involved in that crisis communication so we have cohesive messaging. This would also include if she's in charge of sort of monitoring the social media as well. Your legal team, if you have a legal team, they may be very beneficial in listing them as your crisis team. But again, this is very fluid. So as you use that template that we've provided, you may want to adapt some of this, and that's totally okay. This isn't set in stone by any means. This is just an example of what we've done at the current company that I'm at. So your escalation framework is identifying the level of that crisis. So level 1, this is your most severe crisis. This calls for the highest level of escalation. You're going to want all people in that crisis communication team present. You're going to want your entire crisis team involved anyway. But this is where you're going to want to communicate the urgency of that situation to anyone and everyone. So this could involve by all means, it's something that would fall in level 1. So on an action column, you'll want to identify the person in the team that would need to be involved, and it would be as simple as putting all people in the crisis team. But you'll want to specify what their actions are. Level 2 is kind of a medium risk. This is something that could possibly impact your following or those within your organization. Your level 3, and this could, again, you could create as many levels as you want, but keeping it as simplistic as possible is likely going to help you mitigate that escalation framework better. Moderate impact would be something where rumors could typically spread. It really is essential that everybody within your organization, and in particular your crisis team, is really on the same page in that regard. And then finally, your level 4 could be OG&E has tried installing something on your property, and you have no power at your facility, and so therefore you can't really do anything there. So that would be that level 4. It's minimal impact, and for something like that, it may be as simple as sending a message out to your parishioners or your donors or possibly your staff, but nothing on a wide scale effort by any means. So your communication framework is really going to be your go-to when you're needing to contact people of your crisis team. So you're going to put the department that they're in, their contact name, and their roles and responsibilities. In this area, I would also recommend putting their contact phone number. This is kind of similar to that organizational framework, but this is specifically the action that person would take in the midst of a crisis, not necessarily what their job is within your organization, but what their duty is in the midst of a crisis. So your team leader, that's likely for our organization, would be me, because I would be coordinating a lot of the communication efforts, working with our owner and kind of how they want to operate any sort of decisions. Another action would be designating somebody who's that message development, again, would be your social media and marketing person. But it's defining what their actions are going to be. So you'll always need somebody to monitor kind of what's going on, whether it be email, whether it's voicemails, and really everyone within your organization in the midst of a crisis needs to be diligent about checking their voicemail, especially if it's on the weekend, because a crisis can occur not just Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, not just on Saturdays or Sundays or whenever you're at your house of worship. So it's very, very important. I can't emphasize that enough, to have somebody who is not only developing messages, but they're monitoring some of that. And going on to the next one, sometimes you may only have really that one person on your staff who is working as an office manager, but also kind of operating social media or the website. But it's important to also utilize some of those digital tools available, and making sure that if there's any media mentions, you can set up Google alerts. That might be kind of a higher technological stage of something, but if you understand how to do that, I would highly recommend monitoring things on social media and on Google. Another option would be who's going to communicate with your stakeholders, your board of directors, your executives within your organization. That's likely not going to come from your communications or PR person. It may come from, someone a little bit higher up. And then you'll really want to involve someone, if you have a legal team, kind of what your risk assessment would be making sure that things are in compliance. This would be if I'm drafting a press release, I want to make sure that everything that I have put in that statement or in that press release properly reflects some of the legalities within that company. So there's a couple different phases that you'll go through in the midst of a crisis. One of those is when you're first alerted that a crisis has occurred. So subsequently, you're going to want to monitor everything initially. Try to gather as much information that you can. Make sure you've got as much of the facts possible before, and I wouldn't say before getting in touch with your crisis team, but before you're really deciding to issue a statement, issue a press release. You're going to want to make sure that you've alerted your crisis response team and that it's as straightforward as possible. And it could be that you're using a chat system if you have that within your company, but it has to be with whatever makes sense. I would always recommend that, if possible, alerting your crisis response team and getting on a Zoom call, since most people are familiar with doing Zoom. That way you can kind of have most of your people on board. Because, for instance, if something happens at your organization, at your place of worship, to where you're not able to gather there for whatever reason to kind of mitigate that situation, you need to have another plan in place for you to communicate. Once you've kind of gathered your crisis response team, you need to assess that situation, and you'll do that by looking at your escalation framework and determining the severity of that crisis. Once you've identified the severity of the crisis through that escalation framework, that's when you go into the communication framework and you're activating the thing that's exactly in front of your plan. So a lot of this, and we've got examples that you'll be able to edit as your own templates, if you will, that will be on that Miss Mary has provided. You'll be able to kind of download those holding statements and some of those pre-written messages for certain situations. So that way you're able to activate your communication as soon and quickly as possible. Depending on the situation, I would recommend not waiting more than 24 hours after a crisis to put out a message of some sort. So when you've gathered your crisis response team, there's some questions that you kind of need to go over. You can adapt these in your crisis communication plan. In the template I've provided, I've kind of listed some of those for you. Just some examples and I would probably change the order of what I've put this on, is your staff aware of the crisis? You don't want to put out a statement to the public and your staff, your employees, your parishioners aren't aware. Is there an immediate danger? Have you taken all the steps to handle the crisis? Because you don't want to issue a statement and you don't really have a plan in place to rectify that situation. Is there any information? Is there any kind of questions that the media or the public may ask you? Those are some ideas that you need to keep in mind, because I'll tell you, coming from the media, they love to catch you off guard. In fact, they may ask you that question a second time. For instance, how are you taking control of this situation? Because likely in asking that second question, they're going to get a different answer. Sometimes they may call you and they won't identify what media channel they're on as far as their caller ID. I mean, they'll tell you on the phone, like, hey, this is so-and-so with this newspaper, this television station. I only answer calls of people that I know on my phone, because sometimes a crisis can occur that you're not aware of. And when you're caught unaware, it almost seems like you unknowingly don't have any idea what's going on with your organization. So being able to kind of monitor whatever voicemail they leave, they'll likely say, hey, this is so-and-so with this broadcasting or print company. We got reports of XYZ. So when you get that voicemail, you can say, okay, XYZ, let me figure out what those situations are. So kind of just be very well prepared. There's some people in the media that I'll answer their calls because I know that I have a rapport with them, that they're not trying to, catch me unprepared for a statement. But those are kind of some things that are good starting points prior to issuing a statement. So this is kind of a common thing in crisis communications. They call it the 5 C's. The first one is concern. You don't, if there has been a loss of life, if there's been any kind of casualty, you want to express that concern in whatever statement that you make. Your commitment, if it's especially internal, that we're committed to rectifying the situation and making this a peaceful place of worship as possible. That's an example. Competency is in really how you're handling the crisis. Your communication really needs to be clear. So I would avoid any kind of jargon. If you've had a cybersecurity attack and they have hacked your DNS server and this, that, and the other, you don't want to use terminology that people are like, what are they talking about? So it's really trying to be transparent. So not trying to hide information, but also not trying to use terminology that people aren't familiar with. And then lastly, it's confidence. Because when you're drafting a statement and you're speaking to your audience, you want to communicate in a way that you're assured that you're providing strength and that you don't appear uncertain. So I can show you some examples of that too. So in that, once you have your crisis communication in place, you're in that portion where you're needing to activate that communication plan. Here's some of your guidelines that you'll want to do. If there's victims, you're going to want to notify the family first. You do not want to put out a statement. You do not want to send out an email to people in your database without notifying family first. I'll go even further to say that if someone had unexpectedly had a heart attack, for instance, at your organization, don't issue a statement until you know that that family has issued and notified their family too. It's not just a matter of notifying the family, it's making sure that you're not sending out any kind of widespread information until that family is ready for it. The information, you need to inform your staff next. You never want to put out a press release, like I mentioned, without your staff being aware of a situation. Collaborating with the media is very important as well, because that's kind of controlling the narrative and being able to portray that crisis on behalf of your organization in a way that's not going to be distorted. Trust me when I say that can well happen, especially if you're doing a sit-down interview with a reporter who only has 90 seconds to air your story. They're likely to edit pieces out that you're thinking, oh, okay, all of this is gonna go out on air. That's not the case. Maybe for a live press conference, but even at that, they may just take bits and pieces of that press conference later and edit it. And so you want to make sure that you've kind of collaborated with the media, speak with that reporter, and making sure that really you're, like I said, controlling the narrative. When you're preemptively disseminating information, you're wanting to do that in a way to prevent the spread of rumors. So there's not a bunch of misinformation. It can be as simple as having what we call a holding statement. So a holding statement is very different than really using any kind of press release. We'll get to that in a minute. And then part of the assessment portion is monitoring. So you're likely to receive messages on social media, likely to receive website messages, calls. So you'll want to message, monitor your emails. And as I mentioned before, setting up those Google alerts. So some of this, I think I just pulled up the wrong slide there. Here we go. So a holding statement is very different than a press release. So a holding statement is just a very generic statement that you're sending to, it's pretty much for anyone. So again, if you need to inform your staff first, you could use you could use a holding statement for that, but it's pre-prepared. And I can't emphasize enough how essential a holding statement can truly be in a moment of crisis, because it's really identifying the facts, the who, what, when, where, why. Is your organization taking any actions? And it's brief. So a press release will be in more in depth. A holding statement is very brief. It can be a little bit more, extensive, but you'll notice how we have been informed. Whereas a press release will start off with your organization. Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City recently was informed of XYZ. So your holding statement is going to be a more personal way of speaking to your audience. And this buys you time to get all of the information. So you don't want to send out a press release without knowing all of the facts first. So this is kind of that within 24 hours, here's your generic holding statement. And it could be a little bit more in depth, which I'll show you in this next screen. So it's important to be passionate, positive, action oriented with your holding statement. And it's the timeliness of getting this statement out. So of course, if there's a victim, you want to express that, we're in contact with the victim's family, our thoughts and prayers go out to them. You want to answer that who, what, when, where, why, all of the facts that you possibly can without being too in depth, because again, it's a holding statement. Here's a statement that we're issuing. If there's more information or when there's more information, we'll be forthcoming with that. And you're going to tell as much information in a statement as possible without being too extensive with that. So if there was a situation where there was an act of violence at your organization, one of the things that you'll want to say is, we're investigating the incident, we're cooperating with authorities. Another thing that I've listed on here is we'll be reviewing our procedures, making improvements as necessary. We're immediately putting in place any recommendations. We're devastated. So it's kind of reflecting things that are part of your organization's brand and being transparent. So it's kind of going back to those 5 C's of concern, commitment, and clarity. So every company and organization has a particular way of communicating with their audience. You may not be one to really post on social media. I would highly recommend that all organizations and faith-based organizations have a social media account if you don't. But you're going to have unique ways. There's going to be times where you're going to want to use all of these channels of communication. There may be times where you're just using one. If you need to disseminate information only to your staff, email may be a great way to do it within an all staff email. So your website's interesting because on your website, you can put your holding statement on your website in the form of a banner at the top of your website. And this is where that communication plan comes in place, because if you've identified who is responsible for making website updates, you could say, okay, crisis team, so-and-so, here's the information that we need on the website. Your website is your digital real estate. There are lots of people who, when they are looking for something for a business or an organization, it's your website that they go to. Your social media is interesting because not only is it your own digital real estate, it's offering a way of back and forth messaging. So there could be all different kinds of people who end up on your social media or see your social media post who aren't necessarily part of your audience. So keeping that in mind, that you could have very diverse groups that land on a social media post that you've made to disseminate that information, there could be some very interesting back and forth. I would recommend, unless somebody has made a threat to you on social media, to allow those comments that maybe don't align with your social media. Whether you're responding to them or not is totally up to you, because you could make a post that ends up with 2,000 comments and you can't respond to all of those. I would say that if somebody has taken the initiative to send you a direct message on social media that's not posted publicly, to do your best to monitor those messages and to respond, assuming that that person appears that they have the wherewithal and they're not coming at you in a threatening manner, but to at least respond because they really took that digital effort to communicate one-on-one with you, and not just as what we call a social media troll. They really want to communicate one-on-one. So if it makes sense, encourage that. It is almost like another version of your website, but with a larger group that has the potential to see it. Also with your website, I will say this, that the media likely will look at those 2 areas first, your website and your social media accounts, because they're public places. And so if a reporter calls your organization and they can't get in contact with you, they've likely already looked at your website and social media. but that's a way to issue a statement. And so you're not caught off guard with, we try to reach so-and-so for comment, they weren't available. Like I mentioned, email's great if it's an internal situation that you don't need to communicate with a large audience. You can do it internally, send out a all staff email. If you have a donor database that has been hacked and you need to communicate with those individuals to let them know that there's been some sort of a situation, that's a really great way to do it without broadcasting the issue to the masses. A press release is very much more in depth than what your holding statement is. This is, like I said, it's more in depth. We'll talk about the press release pyramid and how you go about writing a press release. One of the templates that we've provided for Crisis Care Ministries for the Caring in Crisis Tuesday briefs is to also have a press release template available for you to download. So if a situation occurs where you need to release a press release, that'll be available to you. So you're not thinking, how do I write a press release? What format does it need to be in? So I'll also show you an example of that here too. So when you're issuing a press release in your communication plan, you need to have some guidelines set for what those situations look like if you're issuing a press release. And one of those is designating your spokesperson, because that spokesperson is also going to be your contact for your media release. And they may also be the person where if someone from the media receives that press release, that they can are likely to want a little bit more information and may reach out to that spokesperson. So your spokesperson may change depending on the crisis. So if there's an internal issue, you may have one person. If it's something where people are relying on a faith leader to respond, you can have a different spokesperson in that regard. But in having your crisis response team, that's something that can be discussed in the midst of a crisis. So here's kind of an example of what a press release looks like. You don't necessarily have to have your logo there, but it looks nice. Having the contact information, that would be the spokesperson, followed by a phone number and an email address so they can be reached out by the media, because that is kind of the point of the press release. It's here's the information. If you have any more questions, here's how to reach me. Your headline, make it very, very brief. You'll want to put your city and state. For example, Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. There's a Catholic Charities up in Tulsa. So if they were to receive just Catholic Charities of Oklahoma, that's going to be confusing unless I specify what the city is, because there's a couple different organizations in the state. Your second paragraph, it's your who, what, when, where, why, and that's it. Your next paragraph is going to include possibly a quote from someone higher up in your company. It's going to provide some other information, something that could also identify what you're doing to rectify the situation and how you're going to kind of overcome it. And then CTA means call to action. This says such as a free trial, that wouldn't include a free trial, but this may be as information develops, we'll post it on our website or we will send out an email. Likely not an email, because if you're sending out a press release, this is going out to the media. The 3 stars at the bottom are typically hashtags or pound symbols, depending on your age and how you refer to that. Typically below that indicates that the press release is done, and that's the information. Below that, you can put a boilerplate, which would identify some of the key points of your organization. For instance, if this is a pretty bad crisis situation, you don't want it to sound happy go lucky, you may want to even do away with the boilerplate. So in that situation, I would say it's probably a good idea to eliminate that. So this is what we call a press release pyramid. And this is kind of how you'll format that press release. Main facts, who, what, when, where, why, maybe 2 or 3 sentences. On this date, this occurred at this location. People were injured, or maybe they weren't injured, or this is the situation that occurred. Your second paragraph is a little bit more detailed. It's going into the depth of how come it happened? Was it a security breach? You could even move that quote up if there's not a lot of more details to give at that time. You could put a quote. I would really highly recommend for a press release you include a quote, because they really want somebody who's part of the spokesperson to talk about what the situation is. A little bit more info, and then you're going towards the bio or the boilerplate of your press release. Again, you don't necessarily have to have that bio, but what this is a hierarchy of information. Here's the most important information. Here's a little bit more. Here's what we have to say, our executive director, pastor, faith leader. Here's their comment on the situation, a little bit more info. Some of that could be expressing your concern. Maybe if a disparaging comment was made, you could also put that, this doesn't align with our mission and our values. And then as more information is available, we'll put it at our website. Maybe you need to, and you could also include another quote if you wanted to, but I would do main facts, main details, quote, more info. If there's an additional quote, you can, but don't make it too wordy, because people in the media don't want to read a 2-page document on a situation where it's just what your job would be to do with the press release is get them the information they want. If they want more information, that bio will give them, and your contact info will get them everything they need to get in contact with you if they want something further for statement or they have more questions. So here's an example of good PR. It didn't start out as good PR. There was a situation with Nike where there was an unauthorized tweet that sent out. So they actually were very transparent in this press release because they identified exactly, what was said, why it was a disparaging remark. They included a quote. There was a little bit more information saying, law enforcement's looking into this ongoing investigation to figure out who sent out this tweet from a Nike account. So if you're understanding, if something has been sent out from a social media account that's awful from a company or organization standpoint, they need to send out a press release. This wasn't just some internal email that went out. This went out to everybody who follows Nike. Then it also, in this press release, mentioned a press conference, and so it gave the date and the time. And then additionally, it was, how can you get in contact with us? Another statement will be released. So it's kind of just a 1-page document. Here's so you can get a hold of us. And they identified what that situation was, but not too much in depth to be quoted beyond, this is not part of our mission, and this is not the brand that we stand for. So an example of some bad PR is what happened with Equifax a few years ago. There was a data breach, and they waited 6 weeks before they even announced that this was a massive breach. That's a compromise, including myself as well, 143 million Americans. Well, if you're not issuing a statement right off the bat, you automatically have lost confidence with your customers. You weren't transparent, and so in not being transparent, that's a whole domino effect. Even more, they had questionable stock sales afterwards. So when their executives were selling stocks the next day, that looks even worse because they were aware of that situation, didn't notify anyone. And then there wasn't really assistance. So in part of your communication plan, you need to identify, and not really in your plan, in your communication framework, you need to be able to identify in that moment of crisis what you're doing to fix the situation. Your plan, your communication plan is not part of that business continuity that explains how to fix all these problems should they occur. It's how do we communicate that? Well, what they did was they just set up a website. So there wasn't any kind of direct communication with their consumers. And so it was all kind of like, well, what do? We don't really understand. We don't know how they're trying to fix the problem. And then finally, this was awful. So many organizations, I don't know if you schedule tweets and Facebook posts, but it's great when you do. They had a scheduled tweet that said, "Happy Friday," following this announcement of the breach. That's probably not the kind of message that you want to send to your consumers out there. You're likely to want to give more updates, or maybe even pause your messaging to let the dust settle a little bit. Because what could happen is if you put out a post that says Happy Friday after a really bad situation that's involved your company or organization, and somebody comments on it, that's going to populate in other people's feeds. And so they may not have been aware of the initial situation that had occurred. But if you're sending out something that seems completely insensitive, then they're going to be informed on exactly what's going on because they're seeing other people's posts. So that's why your use on social media has to be very, very well thought out of before you do that. So not all situations need to include the media, but you may find that at times speaking with the media works on your behalf. It can be beneficial if you're going to engage with the news, especially if you've thought it was pertinent to send out a press release or a written statement. You might think, you know what, maybe we need to hold a press conference. This could be for different situations. You don't always need to put out do a media briefing, but this would be in rare occasions, but it's good to kind of have this in your communication plan in the event, because trust me, it's expect the unexpected in this kind of thing. Always assume that you're on the record, and always assume that that microphone is turned on and that they're recording, because the worst thing that can happen is that that microphone picks up something that shouldn't. I have seen this many times where the media are there for a press conference. They've alerted people from the anchor desk, like, well, we're just waiting for this press conference to begin. It should happen momentarily. And those mics are hot and you're picking up other things. And there was one where years ago, there had been, I think, maybe it involved a fatality of some sort. That reporter had a hot mic and they were talking about, what they're having for lunch or what they're doing later. And it just was just seemed completely inappropriate and disproportionate to the situation that they were reporting on. If you're engaging with reporters and the situation at hand could be bad for your organization, you might want to engage with them early on, and then you maybe wouldn't need a press conference, but it can work in your benefit if you're going to work with them. And then if you have a spokesperson, make sure that they are exemplifying leadership, saying like, our leadership is dedicated to resolving this situation, and focusing on the good that you do, without being too defensive too, mind you. Whoever you have speaking on behalf of the media, be mindful of a few things. Your posture can exude whether you're confident in the matter. How you're standing, the body language. If you have your arms crossed and you're kind of scowling, that may not look good. But it's also okay to show emotion too. So I would say that in certain situations, there may be a brevity to that situation. Sheriff Tommy Johnson of Oklahoma City had been doing a press conference, and there was a officer involved shooting, and he was displaying a sadness to himself, and he got choked up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because we're all human. But be mindful of that in your communication plan for this kind of purpose. It's good to kind of outline who your spokesperson is going to be. And again, it may not always be your communications or PR director. It may be an executive director. It may be your leader of your house of worship, but just be mindful of who you're having speak on camera. I can't emphasize that enough, because some people get camera shy. When I was in radio broadcasting, if we were doing a live broadcast remote, I would talk to the person beforehand, like, okay, these are kind of the questions I'm going to ask you, or this is what we're going to say. And by the time that mic went live, they froze up. And so that was a whole different situation, but just be mindful that you have someone who is well-spoken, that they're not afraid of cameras, that they understand that there's likely going to be some questions asked that they were not expecting, because a good reporter will ask something outside of that framework that you've provided. I had a friend with News 9 who did a great job of asking questions. She was a politician's worst nightmare, but by golly, she got some questions out there that really kind of brought some things to light, just based on, kind of just based on what she was just throwing out there. So following a crisis, this is just as important because you'll want to conduct a post-crisis review. And in doing that, there may be situations that you learn, well, we should have done X, Y, Z better. You'll want to convene as a group and discuss kind of what are the lessons that we learned together. It could be everything from we didn't respond as quickly. Our messaging should have been more clear or transparent to our internal staff. And this is really, the point of it is to update your crisis communication plan, but it's also essential because it's going to help you evaluate exactly how you're going to handle it in the future, because every situation is different, but there's learning opportunities when you go through a crisis. Nobody ever wants to, go through a nightmare situation, but there are lessons to be learned. Another thing, what you'll want to do is kind of analyze how the crisis occurred to begin with. Was it because you didn't have enough security in place? Let's say someone came into your house of worship and they had already made a threat, for instance. That may be something that you need to analyze. Well, listen, we had these warnings. Perhaps we should have had security in place. So following a crisis, yes, it is important for the crisis communication portion of it, but it's also preventative to not have those crises happen in the future. Again, you do want to update your crisis communication plan depending on some of those lessons learned and how you would mitigate that in the future, and to enhance that preparedness truly, because this is how you're going to take the action to prevent that in the future. Maybe you only have certain doors open to the public at your place of worship or your organization during times of worship or times of business operation. And again, you want to continue monitoring your organization's brand management. So this is talking about making sure that you're monitoring social media, your website. You can even monitor how many people are going to your website. So it may be helpful to notice that as the days go on, that people aren't frequenting your website as much, which means maybe the public relations portion of that crisis has kind of gone down a little bit. Seeking external feedback can be really hard because no one really wants to listen to the negative, but you may talk to friends or family, or kind of understand if you've put something out there on social media, paying attention to what those comments are or what your direct messages were, because it lets you know, it's able to help you gauge how you responded. So sometimes we just can't we can't avoid those negative responses, but it is a lesson learned. So you may need to expect some negative feedback depending on the situation. Okay. And then finally, it's implementing any corrective actions you need to take. You may have learned that your executive director does not speak well on camera. And it may involve some hard conversations. So that's something that you'll need to pay attention to. Maybe your internal communication within your team, let's say you had an internal chat system and it turns out, hey, not everybody looks at that internal chat system on a weekend. Well, that could be a problem moving forward, and you would want to implement some sort of change in your crisis communication plan to be as simple as having your team leader of your crisis communication plan actually pick up the phone and call the people who need to be notified. So those are a few of those actions to be implemented. I want to respond to one question. Matthew Gary said, are there topics you want to avoid in holding statements, press releases, and interviews? I would say, let me just go with the holding statement. Your holding statement's as brief as possible. So we were notified of this situation on this date. More information will be available. This will be, just to use an example, let's say there was a natural disaster, tornado went through. You wouldn't really word it in that regard. Some of the holding statements I have available are a little bit more in depth, which start out with that you're showing your concern for the people in your community and the people that are your staff, your donors, your parishioners. Those are the people. We know that lots of people were impacted by this tragedy. Our thoughts and prayers are with people. We're now, and then you may want to go into that step of what you're going to do. As soon as we identify or as soon as we get some more information, we'll be providing more resources to the community. Or if you already kind of know what you're going to do in that situation, because being in Oklahoma, we respond to tragedy very quickly. You may already have something in place in regard to if you're part of the VOAD, like I think Mary is. So you may already have something in place. So that would be an area that you could identify. As far as a press release, there's not really anything that you would want to avoid as far as any topics. You don't want to go off topic. You only want to talk about the situation at hand. What happened, where it happened, how it happened, why did it happen? A statement on behalf of your organization or your company, or on behalf of yourself, that expressing the concern, being transparent with the information, possibly giving possibly putting a quote in there. But your press release, if you're issuing a press release, it's because something pretty big has happened and you need to control the narrative. So if you're issuing a press release, it's likely because you're expecting that possibly people from the media would reach out to you, or that there may be media interest or community interest. So if I am working at Catholic Charities, for instance, at one point we had resettled 1,800 refugees from Afghanistan. So a press release doesn't necessarily have to be negative, but it was almost a crisis situation when you go from resettling 200 refugees a year to now we have 1,800 coming within a matter of weeks, and a matter of just a few months. So a press release in that regard would be, it's not necessarily a crisis per se, but it is something that is unexpected and unplanned. So you can rely on your crisis communication plan and looking at how you would operate that press release. It's that we are here to help our neighbors who were also neighbors of ours overseas. We're committed to, and you want to, really show your confidence in the situation, that we're committed to resettling these individuals to the best of our ability. How are we going to do that? We're going to work with other community partners and other organizations. And lastly, how people can reach out and how they can help. It's not necessarily, well, if you want to reach us for more comments, visit us at our website. It could be, if you would like to work with us in sponsoring families, you can reach us at catholiccharities.ok.org. So those are kind of some things. In doing a media briefing, you can work with the media prior to starting the media briefing. So sometimes it could just be that you're calling individuals from the media if you have a relationship with them. But prior to starting that press conference, you can kind of lay out some things like, we're going to keep this brief. We're going to keep this 5 minutes. We've got to stay on topic. A thing that you can mention, especially if there's been some sort of scandal or misconduct, you can always rely on the legality arm of it. So for instance, let's say there was sexual misconduct within your organization and a reporter asks something, and this is why you really want to make certain that your spokesperson well spoken, is that one thing they can say is, we're still investigating the situation. We cannot comment on the legality of the nature. We'll have more information as it's available. And then kind of rely on, and not that you don't want to be transparent, but you don't want to give too much information that could harm your reputation. So it's really trying to control the narrative, if that makes sense. So that's why you need to look through, what are some questions that the press could possibly ask? Do we have all of the facts? Do we have all of the information? And being able to prepare properly will kind of mitigate some of that situation. So I have put my information on this last PowerPoint slide. If anyone wants to shoot me an email at any time, if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to call me. And I guess we'll just open this up to a little Q&A if anybody had any questions. I know I can get to talking. Oh, I'm sorry, Donna. This isn't the Q&A. This is called Afterglow. And can shoot a whole bunch of information out, and I could really, I told Mary I could probably spend an hour on specific things such as press releases, media briefings, how you monitor some of your technology, your social media, your website. But I think when you download the communication plan template, I think it's really going to kind of help you really look at that in a concrete way and be able to map out how you would respond. And especially with what I would say, the organizational framework, your escalation framework, and then moving on to communication framework, it's going to help you really assess and activate how you would respond in a moment of crises.
Well, Carly, I think at this point we will begin to formally close the official part of our webinar. And I know that you all join me in saying thank you. What amazing information. The templates, you all, go to crisiscareministries.net, to the webinar hub, to the schedule and resources tab there, and you'll find those templates. You may have to refresh your page because we update that website pretty often, but they're wonderful templates, and I highly encourage all of you to go check those out at the website. So Carly, again, thank you so much for your time. We'll spend a few minutes afterwards, after we close the recording, just being able to have some after conversation. But I want to thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you next week as we welcome Brian Candelaria, who's the staff attorney for Oklahoma Indian Legal Services, and Krista Figgins, Director of Mission Advancement for Legal Aid Services of Oklahoma. Heroic work they do, Oils and Lasso, heroic work that they do as they talk with us about in good faith, faith and community pathways for critical for disaster survivors. So thank you all again for being here, and we'll turn off the recording and hope to see you all next week.